Guten Abend, liebe Gäste.
Good evening, dear guests. My name is Camille Barrier, and I'd like to welcome you very warmly in the name of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Welcome to Berlin and welcome to everyone online in the live stream. Today, we're going to talk about the role of religious right-wing networks and their influence on the anti-gender politics in Italy and Europe. Because sexual and reproductive rights are under pressure in Italy. The far-right government, headed by Giorgia Meloni, makes it difficult to get access to abortion. They attack the equal opportunities and also undermine democratic institutions. These developments are to be observed beyond Italy, too. International religious right-wing networks are influencing politics in many countries, and they try to undermine the reproductive and LGBTQIA+ rights. This is why we're all the more happy to discuss these developments with you and to hear from the experts on our panel. But before I pass the floor to the moderator, I'd like to mention some organizational things. Today, the panel will be in Italian and German, but there is a simultaneous translation in German, Italian, and English. So if you need a headset, you can get one at the door. Once the discussion is over, you will have the option of asking your questions. And after this event, we would like to invite you to have something to drink and a bite to eat with us. And also, I'd like to thank our partners, our partner ANPI, for the cooperation in this event, and also our thanks to the colleagues from our Paris office, where the work in Italy is coordinated. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues from the EU and North America Department and the Global Unit for Feminism and Gender Democracy. And last but not least, a big thank you to all our panelists and the moderator, Sarah Ulrich, who will lead us through this evening. And now I'm happy to pass the floor to you, Sarah.
Ja, schönen guten Abend.
Good evening. So thank you very much, Camille, for the kind introduction. I'm also very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you. It may be that we need a moment to adjust the headsets and select the channels. I hope you can hear the translation. Give me a thumbs up. So we have a simultaneous translation into Italian and also into English. So I'm going to speak in German. And as I said, if you need a translation, feel free to get headsets at the door. We have translation devices just outside the room. So why are we having this event? I mean, first of all, because it's a very pressing topic in Italy. Camille already mentioned it. I'm not going to repeat what she just said. I personally, I'm a freelance journalist, and I had a fellowship from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I looked into this topic. I did research in Italy, and I talked to Jonathan and to Massimo about this, and they have given me very helpful information. And together with my colleague, Anna Dotti, I published an article in the Taz newspaper here in Germany. And what I found quite terrible to see as a person who is looking into far-right politics, etc., and the forces influencing this, what was really terrible to see for me, how far this has advanced in Italy, how individual actors have actively involved in writing these motions, as they are called in Italy. Maybe you can explain later what's the difference between a law and a motion in Italy. So this type of shaping politics, and they're actively involved in that. And this is what we're going to discuss today we have three experts on our panel, and I think that we are quite lucky to have them. Jonathan Lomascolo is next to me. He's an expert for the Christian right in Europe in general. He published a wonderful book, The Christian Right in Europe. You can download it for free online, and it gives you an excellent overview of the movement in Europe and also in Italy. He's also the Deputy Director of Faith in Democracy, and they work on this topic specifically, and they develop strategies to try and stop this advancement of the religious right. Hello, Jonathan. Happy to have you. Thank you. I'm also happy to be here. Then we have Chiara Fonzi. She jumped in, so thank you very much. It was very short notice, and we're very happy to have you. Chiara is digital marketing specialist, and she's also volunteering for Lega. I'm not going to pronounce the Italian word. Let me tell it in German. That is the Association of Pro-Choice Gynecologists in Italy, and she is going to speak about what it means in practice for persons who want to have an abortion, what it means to them that this policy tries to restrict their right to self-determination in reproduction. Thank you very much for being here. And Massimo Brearo, I'm also very happy to have you, Massimo. He's a leading expert on the anti-gender movement in Italy. He's a researcher at the University of Verona, and he has published several works on this topic. For example, the book Anti-Gender Mobilization, Religion and Politics, an Italian case study. And Massimo was extremely helpful in giving me insights into the anti-gender movement in Italy. So thank you very much for being here, Massimo, and thank you for sharing these insights with us today. So let me start with one thing. We already heard about infringement of democratic rights, international networks, gender equality is tackled, the right to abortion is restricted, democratic institutions are undermined. But what does this mean specifically? Could you give me some specific examples? During my preparation, or when we met before, I asked you about examples. It was interesting because two of you mentioned the Valditara decree. Is that such a motion, la mozione Valditara? Perhaps you can explain what exactly this means and why this is one new example for this type of anti-gender politics. So what is happening?
Yes, well, first of all, good evening, and thank you for this invitation and the organization of this event. Quite quickly, to understand where we stand and the anti-gender policies that the government is working on, what you mentioned now, this law Valditara is one of the last ones that were put on the table of a parliamentary discussion. But first of all, we have to go one step backwards. And September 2024, when a deputy of the majority of the Lega, Sasso, passed in the Parliament, in the Commission for Culture, a motion. So it's not a law. It isn't a regulation. It hasn't got a normative strength and power. But it is a symbolic act, because for the first time in a document we talk about the Parliament, we talk about gender ideology. So a parliamentary of a majority passes a text that commits the government to put in act all the measures to object the gender ideology in schools in particular. Therefore, that was the preceding step that consented to the government to say that on the basis of indication of a parliament that meets with a certain legitimacy, to propose certain to propose a law that went in that direction. Therefore, in spring, many deputies proposed these laws, and then the government, with the Minister for Education, Valditara, does this proposal in order to suggest, let's say, to forbid sexual education in schools up to the upper school. That means forbid it completely, not general sexual education, but all projects that are often organized in these schools by associations, experts, and external actors in order to forbid that all these projects and activities can be organized in the schools. Adding then another element that for the upper schools, when these activities are organized, first of all, you have to have an authorization, and the minister calls it preventive informed consent of the families. That is a kind of preventive censorship. That means the families have to be informed explicitly of a kind of activity that is being organized, the curricula of the people that organize it, the materials that will be used. That means that it is a way to give the families the possibility to object to these activities. Therefore, we have this modality that is typical of these anti-gender organizations like Pro-Life, Pro-Vita, Famiglia, that pushes the families to be active in the schools when they hear speaking about gender discrimination, respect, bullyism, and they say, watch it, when you talk about these things, it is gender, it's the gender theory, it's an indoctrination of children, and therefore they give an instrument, a law instrument to the families so that the schools stop organizing these activities that aren't part of what the minister did previously. That means it gives national guidelines to the schools. They were called school agenda. And in that case, we talk about sexual education, but a certain sexual education that is limited to the knowledge of a sexual body, and then the respect of the differences between the genders and respect of women. That means sexual education that's very limited if we compare it to the sexual educations that are proposed by the international authorities. So this is an example that is quite clear about what is happening at the level of anti-gender movement, and that once the government Meloni, they've made proposals of law and have translated into concrete actions, and they've proposed these laws. So it isn't just a symbolic speech, but it's going to be, now it's being taken on in the last 10, 15 years, and now it's becoming a force of law.
Thank you very much for those insights. Jonathan, I mentioned your book. You compared, so to speak, several countries. You showed several countries. You did research and also looking at them in comparison. What would you say? What is specific about Italy? So Massimo told me once, Italy is like a case study for the anti-gender politics that we will see in the future in Europe. Why is that? Well, Italy is a very good example for what happens when the far-right radical parties come into power. And you see this in this cultural war topic of anti-gender. This is used to divide, and it is used to marginalize people who are already marginalized even further. And this is done by a targeted change of public opinion, and also by disinformation, misinformation, and it is also done through these initiatives, these motions, these law drafts that are brought to Parliament, and these legal initiatives are also a clear sign that a pattern is manifesting in Europe and worldwide. So this topic, like sexual education in schools in the last month and all of last year, this has been very prominent. So it was, so to speak, one of the most decisive topics during the presidential electoral campaign, where the pro-democratic candidate failed narrowly, and this topic was right on top of the agenda as the decisive topic that seemed to have all Poland in its grasp. I mean, all of Poland were discussing this, even though there was a good solution by the Polish government that has been in power for 2 years. They had a good solution of having a compromise, and this has happened in Italy with our right government. It happened in Poland. Of course, years ago, it happened in Hungary with a decision that is very similar. So, and also beyond Europe, for example, it works quite well to use this topic to polarize, to frame LGBTQ communities as the problem. So every time when it's about what isn't working in our country, where are the problems, they focus on the LGBTQ community with their hard-won rights, or the rights they haven't won yet. They are always put to the fore as the scapegoat to divert the attention from the real problems. And this is why we are seeing this in Brazil with Bolsonaro. I mean, that's exactly the same topic. Even in India with the Hindu nationalism, also sex education is a topic there. So these are really motives, so to speak, that repeat themselves. And they not only want to discriminate against people, but also they are the first stepping stone to erode democracy. Thank you very much. And what we already heard in the announcement for this event, and which is often used as a leverage when it comes to religious population, is the right to reproductive self-determination, i.e. the right to abortion. So in Italy, there are different different goals. They are tackling LGBTQIA, but also reproductive rights. Chiara, maybe you can give us a practical example. So these political changes and these undermining of democratic rights, what impact do they have on the people in the local communities, so people who need health care?
Well, I would also underline the points of violence, the violence of these laws, because sexual education, in any case, is a topic that is explored at a scientific level. There's research that is carried out. That means that we have concrete data that show how important it is to manage certain social phenomena like abortion itself, against which this government has stated itself. So education is important for prevention, but also sensitive situations like gender dysphoria. That means some young people could take a psychological pathway of a certain kind. That means they could be at risk of suicide. Then we have violence against women. And Italy has a great problem in feminicide. And therefore, the politicians talk in certain ways so that people don't understand them. But actually, it is a problem for the people. And we have seen that there was an inspection in the hospital of Careggi in Florence, in which they did an X-ray they really analyzed in depth the protocols that were applied. This center was specialized in the management of gender dysphoria. That means all the cases of people below 18 years old that had really big problems, people that came from the whole of Italy and went to that hospitals, and that they had a pharmacological therapy that was given to them, and there was a request for a re-examination and a review of all the protocols, and they changed compared to what they had done previously. Therefore, this is all to say that, yes, that this policy is done on the skin of the people, so to say, and we have consequence. We've seen in Emilia when the woman of these minors objected to this situation, and they protected the health staff. This just to link back to Valditara, the motion, and for religious education, as I was saying, for sexual education, we talked about indoctrination when they screamed or shouted aloud against sexual education. But we don't talk about indoctrination when we talk about religion, and the families have to sign to not go to the lesson of the Catholic Church. So in the public schools, until you're 18, you have to follow the Catholic religion unless you don't sign, whereas sexual education is either forbidden or you have to prove it explicitly. So if you have a homophobic family, then the children have not the possibility to evolve as a person and to understand in depth the society in which they are living. And probably these people are subject to bullyism, and there's a certain limitation in their possibility of reaction. And it would be important that if people have personal problems as gender identity, they should have the instruments in the school in order to talk about it with someone. And the health staff, we must say, the ones I interact with mainly, and we see really at all levels. The healthcare in Italy is a bit federalistic organization. We have national laws, but these are more guidelines that are given to the regions, and the regions should play a role and surveil on the quality of the health services. But that doesn't actually happen, and that also related to abortion. Our association collects or is an association for staff that are pro-abortion, and they give assistance to anyone who would like to abort. And then at a local level, we have local association that talk to these health staff. And these people are tired because we know that the healthcare staff is really for long hours in the hospitals. And we know that the health systems are very complicated. There's lack of staff. They're always under stress. And then they have a request of access to data. And this is something that can be done for transparency. So private citizens and journalists can request the data that exists but that aren't published, because they're there, but you can't publish everything. But for means of transparency, you can request this data. And healthcare staff who shouldn't be bothering about this stuff has to react to these requests. And they have requests how these protocols work, and they don't understand it. But the political climate can be touched really in real life, and they feel the pressure all the time. They feel observed, and very often these are political issues. They put requests. They don't understand how the system works, and probably this instrument isn't fought for the healthcare staff to start tackling and managing data. They have to take care of everywhere day. Let's say this is a bit complicated, but it was just to give you a quick idea.
Vielen Dank. Also es hat schon ganz reale Auswirkungen.
Thank you very much. So it has a real impact in the clinics or in the families, in schools. So there's enormous pressure on those involved. Massimo, I'd like to ask you once again. Chiara mentioned that there are protests outside of clinic doors and putting pressure on the medical professionals who do abortions or who do treatments for gender adaptation. So this is a known strategy of religious actors to protest in front of clinics where abortions are done, blocking the entrances and harassing the medical professionals and harassing the persons who want to enter the clinics to be treated and to put pressure on them. In Italy, who are those actors? So I was looking into one association, that's Pro Vita e Familia, and I know that Pro Vita e Familia, they organize such protests. Maybe, Massimo, you could tell us a bit about them and about Antonio Blandi and who the actors actually are and how they present in public.
Well, let's see if I can give you an overview so that we can understand this galaxy of actors that is very heterogeneous, there are many networks, and that are at times in conflict. First of all, we have to remember that in the field of activism, that means Catholic activism, pro-life, against free choice. There's an organization that has been existing in Italy since that is the Movement for Life, Movimento per la Vita, and it's a mainstream association that has had, let's say, has had the leadership of Carlo Casini for 30 years, and now the daughter is the president of this movement. This movement was built up in the years, and there are many volunteers of the centers pro-life, so these are spaces in which some people work, and very often, as I was saying, voluntaries that have no medical background. They are simply activists, and their target is just to see which women intend to abort in order to put a hurdle against this, and therefore take them not to make this choice and push them to make a different choice. And this movement was in the certain regions, center-right, were supported in many hospitals. And these associations have rooms in the hospitals, and they can give their counseling with certain strategies. They can speak to the doctors as if they were nurses of HCPs and speak with the women who think they are talking to somebody of the healthcare system, and instead they are talking with an activist pro-life that is against abortion, that the only thing they want to do is to lead the women not to interrupt their pregnancy. This project started in the 70s, and this work is done on the field. In the last few years, that means 2010 specifically, there was a certain movement within the movement itself. So many people, many activists started to criticize the fact that this movement was a bit too moderate on these issues linked to abortion and special euthanasia. And certain people objected the presidency of this Casini, that was also a politician, saying that they were too political and they were too much center, too much moderate, and that's why they came out of that movement and they made Marcia per la Vita, a movement of Catholic activists, radicals, integralists, fundamentalists, and that object. So not only they work on the field and do activism and voluntary work, These were people that were militant. They wanted to really object and have a voice in the political life. This movement worked before in the hospitals, in the rooms, but wasn't in the public space. And there is that these first association starts, Pro Vita Onlus, Giuristi per la Vita, and then in 2013, Manito Sport Italia, and these are activists that come from the movement, Movimento per la Vita, and then we see what happens in France that was exported in other countries, and they understand that this is the kind of movement I want to bring to Italy. That means a movement that has a certain identity, not a religious identity. That means that Mani pour tous isn't a religious movement, but allows to have an identity of civilians, of families, of parents that all have concerns about this gender theorism and the inclination of Europe at the moment. So they've created this Manif pour tous, so they start objecting, and they do silent sit-ins, and they bring about petitions. And what happens? The parties of the right-wing and far-right, Fratelli d'Italia and La Lega in particular, right from the first manifestation, support them. They object with them. Lucio Manvis of Fratelli d'Italia, he is present, sitting on the floor with these people at the first manifestation of Mani pour tous in Italy. So the politics see in this movement a resource for mobilization, a resource that is able to attract votes. And which votes? The votes of the Catholic people. The Catholics who are trying in the last few years how to where to position themselves to be democratic. Fratelli d'Italia, Lega is probably too much right. Therefore, they are trying to find their position, and they think that strategy can work. That's why they invest in these movements. They support them. And the first big success that they claim, then we could continue to make another political discussion, but they say it's very the success of Fratelli d'Italia, the elections of 2018, went from 3-4% to 7%. That means doubled its voters, and that's the beginning of the rise that brought to the 30% that they have now, and the movements like Manif pour tous that changes name because it stops being an objecting movement, but it becomes an advocacy movement, a lobbying movement, and that's why it's called now Pro Vita and Famiglia, Family Day. And at the time, it helps the success of Fratelli d'Italia, and it's the beginning of an electoral campaign that these groups do. And what we see in 2022 is the restitution to these movements from Fratelli d'Italia of the favors of the work done on the field that led to elect Simone Pilon of Lega, Eugenia Rogella, the Minister for Family, that comes from these movements. And just to mention one person, Alfredo Mantovano, that you probably don't know, that is the Undersecretary to the Presidency, and he's the executive arm of Meloni. It's the person that works to coordinate the work of the government with the parliamentary majority, probably the person that is the most powerful in Italy, I could say. Therefore, what we see that certainly movements that started as a radical activism, a bit marginal, in the end, in a few years, managed to restructure themselves, and they become an advocacy group acknowledged by the parties as legitimate and are also an electoral resource, and therefore they can take on these policies.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to link up to this. I mean, in the research I did with Anna Dotti, we had an email leak from a network that's called Agenda Europe. It doesn't exist anymore because there was a blow-up, and they definitely will have changed names. So there were different people from different countries involved. It was a European network consisting of people from the so-called pro-life movement that promote this kind of anti-gender activism, but also anti-abortion activism. And these people in that mailing list exchanged ideas about how they could specifically influence policy making. For example, they talked about how terrible it was that the Istanbul Convention was signed, which protects women, actually. And this Agenda Europe is called an extremist Christian network in the heart of Europe by experts. And Jonathan, I'd like to ask you, in your book, you mentioned that this Christian right, there is a triangle of collaboration. So who cooperates with whom? Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit more. So where is the triangle? Who is involved? And where is the international angle here? I mean, people are having this international exchange via mailing lists. I think things go beyond that. Could you tell us maybe where these ideas come from and where are they being spread? What is interesting in Europe is that we have lots of different political systems here when it comes to the relation between the state and the religion. After World War II, we had new structures shaping. There are countries like France or Italy where the constitution states laicism, there's a strict separation. There are countries like Germany where we call it positive neutrality, so the state is neutral towards religion, but basically religions are supported, and also religious organizations. So there are these different models. There are also state church, for example, also in the Scandinavian countries. But one thing that has been a red line since the World War II, there has been the taboo about the cooperation between extreme right forces and the churches. This has been a cultural standard, a cultural norm that has arisen since World War II, because during that war we have seen what happens when extreme right ideologies connect to the huge influence and networks of the church. This cultural norm has existed all over Europe for many years, that this should not happen again. And this is reflected in the political systems and in the different religious communities. So this is established. What has changed is that in the past 20, and Italy even the last 30 years, that there has been a normalization of far-right ideologies and party organizations. So these extreme right parties have gained influence in Italy since the mid-90s with Berlusconi, who he started with the mini party, so to speak, Fratelli d'Italia, to normalize this within the system. And there's an interesting speech he held 5 or 6 years ago. He was looking back and he said, well, I pulled you up from the margins, and now you have better results in the elections than I, in the surveys than I have. So what has changed is the political backing of all these ideas, and they have become mainstream to an extent. And against this backdrop, we have this new discovery of the connection between state and church. So on the one hand, we have ultra-conservative, radical far-right parties, populist radical parties who know that religion is power. Religion gives them more power and more voters, even in secularized societies as we have in Europe. So there's a huge potential, and they want to tap into that by using a type of language that speaks to religious voters. They use topics that speak to those voters. But also, they want to appear too religious, too Christian, because they know that for religious parties, Christian parties, the voter segment is too small in the secular Europe. When we look at Germany, for example, where we have the Bible-based Christians, never more than 0.3% in the federal elections. They just don't have the potential in the secular society. So they're kind of in conflicts. They want to speak religion, but they don't want to appear too religious. On the other hand, we have the ultra-conservative religious actors, for example, from churches. They could also be activists or even priests or bishops, pastors, who strongly stand for these ultra-conservative, non-democratic convictions. But in the past, they never had a political contact. They didn't know how to insinuate these religious positions into politics, how to enter policy making. And now these far-right parties are coming up, and these religious actors all at once want to cooperate with those far-right parties, but at the same time they're facing the pressure from their religious structures like bishops' conferences or other persons of authority, not to be too political, because it is still a taboo in Europe. So these two forces, far-right parties and extreme right, ultra-conservative religious actors, they want to come together, but they don't know how. And to bring them together, the NGOs enter the stage. These anti-gender organizations, they work as a platform to bring together these two partners who want to come together, but they can't. It's like policy platforms. Platforms that construe political opinion. They discuss strategies there. They talk to each other. They balance these political and ideological strategies and mix them. And they are able to bridge the gap that has been created by that strong taboo in Europe. So I think this is a very important aspect, which in Italy is working quite well. But also we can see this worldwide. So in some way, you always have this taboo about this cooperation, and the anti-gender movements are the perfect tool to be successful in the population and bring them together. And it becomes clear that we have these narrative alliances in the sense that two phenomena come together. So on the one hand, we have the sacralization of politics. Politicians are starting to use more religious symbols in their language. In Italy, for example, it is an interesting example we're having. Matteo Salvini, in 2009, the European electoral campaign, he took out his rosary and he said the Madonna. We said, we dedicate this country to you. We, as the Italian people, we hail you. I mean, this is a politician. How can he pull out the rosary and speak like a religious person? And on the other hand, we have the politicization of religion, where we have religious figures who talk like politicians all at once without any kind of... So, I mean, they openly speak politically. I mean, they don't stand for elections. They don't do that. But they talk about politics, though, like they were politicians. And when we look to Russia, it is what we see. For example, I'm traveling to the Far East, to Russia. So when the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, the Patriarch Kirill, says that all soldiers who die in Ukraine die for Russia, and they automatically go to heaven. This is the counterpart, where we see the politicization of religion. Thank you very much. And when you were saying this, I was thinking of an example from Germany, because the campaign against Frau Gersdorf is the best example for something like this. She was to be elected to the Constitutional Court. She was the SPD, the Social Democrats candidate. She was a great expert, legal expert. And at some point, she was in favor of liberalization of the abortion law in Germany. And there was a campaign by exactly these NGOs, Citizen Go, that is a platform doing these campaigns all over Europe. And they collected so many signatures, and so many Christian democratic politicians were influenced by them and not to vote for her. So in the end, Frau Gersdorf had to withdraw her candidacy because the pressure from the far-right corner became too strong. So we're seeing this everywhere, kind of. And I think it is really terrible to see to what extent it has entered our democratic institutions, and it has also entered our schools. And so to leave some time for a discussion later, I would now to become a bit constructive. I mean, the situation is terrible, but we also have to talk about how we can deal with it and how we can protect our democratic values. Chiara, so you, sorry for making a mistake with your name, Chiara, you told me before that you as a group do petitions, and you go on site and you try to talk to local activists and politicians and to work for protecting those rights. Maybe you could specifically tell us what is your approach and how you have been successful in this way when you work in civil society directly, going to the communities with specific topics and also try to protect democratic rights there.
Concretely, first of all, I would like to say that let's say the law courts is a good place for us, because when at a regional level, but also at a national level, you start making laws against human rights or even rights given by constitution, all we can do is organize ourselves as civil society and try to start using lawyers and go to the law court, or even, for example, there's a hospital in Turin when a room was organized to give consultancy, as I was saying before, to the people that are there for abortion. If there hadn't been activist coalitions, in that case, it wasn't my association. We try to work in networks. Networks is very important. We haven't got many resources compared to the resources of the sponsored groups. Therefore, networking is really vital to us. And this group in Turin that had lawyers that worked pro bono, and together with the trade unions, they managed to bring in court the reason why the documents were read, and they stopped this consultancy room because it wasn't doctors that were giving the consultancy, but it was these activists. However, the guidelines of the ministry have to be implemented. In 2020, there were the guidelines that update the norms and concerning abortion. Therefore, we must say in the region Marche, for example, the laws 5 years later have not been applied in the updated form, And now we have an alliance with certain people that are also politicians. Therefore, in the region, the local healthcare responsible supports us because we have shown that it is important that science makes progress. Also, the law 194 that is on abortion says that it is important that the techniques in the healthcare advance, and if these health ministries say that it's important, that this has to improve, why in the hospitals this doesn't happen? Why doesn't happen in the regions? So the region doesn't monitor quality. And I must also say that in certain regions where the government follows Meloni, there's a certain application, whereas in the south of Italy, the application of the law doesn't evolve, and that is for cultural reasons in the south of Italy, and therefore it's difficult to give a certain quality service. In the Marche, a lot of progress has been made, and often this region has applied local laws before they were implemented at a national level. They were, for example, agreements on a local level, for example, and there were people that went to the hospital for voluntary interruption of pregnancy, and they were went to the centers of the anti-abortionists. And in the region Marche, there's still this problem that the access to abortion with the pills, for example, is not following the law. It is only given up to the 7th week, whereas actually they should be given also after 9 weeks. And there are also many other issues and things that are said from the ministry. But the application of law is asymmetric, and the region Marche was a bit particular because this limit of 7 weeks obviously isn't good for the people, because if a person sees that they are pregnant, then they have a test, and the structures are too slow. And then we also have the problem that by law you have to wait for 7 days. Once you have a certificate, you have to wait 7 days before you can act. That then prolongs the times, and in the end, the pill cannot be used. And in this region, we saw that this happened very often, and we see it reflected in the statistics. And therefore, we organized this petition to sensitize the people on this issue, because there are some things that you don't realize until you really touch them with your own hands. And then there's the stigmatizations. You don't always talk about these questions with your friends. Therefore, we went to the media so that the people become aware of what happens. And we see that in this region there was a certain resistance until the moment, well, under the pressure, I think that started about 2 years ago, the health responsible of the region said publicly that this was left to the autonomy of the healthcare staff. Before that, the healthcare staff did nothing because they knew what the political declarations were. And we must say the healthcare staff is people that work for, so to say, the state. They shouldn't be activists. They should just do their work. And there was a doctor in Ascoli Piceno that finally took on this responsibility and then updated the protocol of his hospital, the only hospital in the whole region. And this after 4 years that that law had been approved, and where nothing had happened, and the people had to go outside the region for abortion. And association, we supported the scientific approach, and I supported also but obviously the local people did really a lot. And it was really good to see this networking. So we are a national association, and we had the local associations, and then we had the politicians, and therefore it was a positive moment of networking in the city of Fabriano. The petition was put on the table of the municipality, and the women, left and right-winged, together put over a motion in the communality, and they asked to the region Marca to finally put a certain pressure on the health structures in order to start and make progress in the situation. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to go to the law court for our rights. The problem will be when the law courts will no longer be possible to use, and we must say they cost a lot.
Ja, vielen Dank für diesen Einblick. Und das ist
Thank you very much for those insights. And my next question links up to this. It seems to be a development that when the laws are changed, you cannot go through the courts. Massimo, I remember the Sasso motion. The EU said that this motion, the Sasso motion, probably was violating the EU. I can't think of the word. The EU Human Rights Convention, actually. And I was asking myself, what does it mean when the EU talks about Italy violating, infringing human rights? Isn't there the option of Europe exerting some pressure on that country? Because it's European politics, isn't it?
Vorrei fare questo appunto per comprendere.
I would like to mention something. When Chiara was speaking, we must first of all understand the Italian situation and the law structure in Italy and the level of protection of human fundamental rights, especially of the people and LGBTQIA+. And we must remember that Italy is probably the only country of the European Union that protects the LGBTQ people. That is low. There's no protection because all the years in which the left, that means the center-left, was at the government, they didn't do what the left in other countries, like in Spain, Portugal, France, did. That means the laws to have access to marriage between same-sex people, assisted procreation, laws against transphobia, bisphobia, or institutionalize the gender education, the laws for self-determination. All that doesn't exist in Italy. The only things that exist in Italy is a law on civil partnerships, but is a small law that acknowledges the right of the same-sex marriage as approved in 2016. So that means very late compared to other countries after a debate that lasted 3 years in Parliament and that led to a law that is quite reduced and in terms of level of protection. That means that the fact that the right, and that must say there's a paradox in Italy, we talk about the left for the governments that actually were middle left and more middle than left, and for those of far right, we say center right, and that's a bit strange in Italy. Therefore, in the press, let's say in the media, you use right in order to say I'm a bit more right, and far right and radical according to the political classifications of those party families, so to say. The point is that if the radical right, the far right at the government today can do this work of, as we said before with David Paternotti, that is also present here today, to sort of, let's say, sort of reinterpret these aspects. It's because at the moment there's nothing. There was an emptiness at present. Therefore, it's easier to write and to have programs in which we say that sexual education means only a certain thing, because there's nothing behind it. There's nothing that you have to eliminate. There's nothing that can be eliminated. We can only build something new, and that is very specific to Italy. The work that the Meloni government is doing is very easy, because simply we put laws where there aren't any. And it's if there's already certain laws and practices and regulations and local practices, it's more difficult. In the schools, for example, sexual education, it wasn't institutionalized. It was always be done based on the autonomy of the school, and it was on a voluntary basis of the teachers, but also used external people and organized projects. But it wasn't actually in the school official program. Therefore, now I've forgotten your question, unfortunately. But what I wanted to say actually is, I'm sorry. It's all very interesting. It doesn't matter. However, it leads us to the question. The question was, if European Union says that these human rights are hit, what should happen at a European level in order to see so that we stop the diminution of democracy in Italy?
Ok, adesso ho capito perché ho fatto questa premessa.
Okay, now I've understood. Now I know what I wanted to say, actually. Another specific situation for Italy is that on paper, Italy isn't Hungary of Orban. On paper, Italy has certain things, like Italy has a national strategy, LGBTQ, and it was adopted by the government, Draghi, so the preceding government to Meloni. Therefore, on paper, Italy has a certain performance and has certain standards with a national LGBT strategy, but it has no finances, and it was never applied, and it shall also never be applied, but it was adopted. If we look at the institutional documents of a national office anti-discrimination, that is the one that also takes care of the policies for LGBTQ+. On paper, there's everything that a democratic country has to have that protects the rights of minorities. The point is that it's not implemented. It's only on paper. That means that let's say, the capacity of Italy is to be formally good. That means we always stay at a minimum level of standards. Therefore, there's no need for intervention of the European Union. But then we have the problem of the application of what is on paper, but what happens also with law on abortion. And these movements pro-life have understood it, and their target is not to abrogate the law, but to implement the law in a way that avoids the law to be implemented.
Okay, so it's more a task for civil society, maybe, or for other institutions to maybe create some pressure. And Jonathan, Faith for Democracy, you were founded actually to develop such strategies to counteract these movements. What are your strategies? What can you tell us from your knowledge about this? What could we use? Where could we approach this? So when we look back for 100 years and the large changes we've seen, or how people have lived 100 years ago, for example, and if we look at who was involved in the partisan fight in Italy, also the resistance in Germany, who was involved in civil rights organizations and movements in the United States, who was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, who was involved in the Solidarność movement in Poland, and also in Dalit rising and uprising in India. All these were people who used their religious faith to point out injustices. And I think when we're talking about processes of autocratization and erosion of democracy and discrimination against people of the LGBTQ community and also discrimination against women's rights activists, I think there is a huge potential that is not being used. There's also a huge responsibility of those who are part of religious communities to become active and to say clearly and to understand that there are things that are going wrong and they need to do something about it. So it's all quite straightforward, but there are three big problems. One, there is a lack of awareness within religious communities in Europe. So being aware that you're not as secularized as you might think. Religion is a big factor in Europe. So one side has armed itself, and progressive religious voices are just standing there a bit abashed, and they don't know what to say. Those are chaotic forces, but they don't perceive the huge impact it has on individual persons, peoples whose lives are ruined because you're just passively standing by. So there's a lack of information, lack of awareness, theologically and politically, what all this means. And the second thing is that the extreme Christian right has excellent transnational networks between Trump and Europe, for example. It's not as if the Americans look towards Europe and the Europeans look towards America and say, we want to do it as Trump does. No, it's the other way around. Trump looks at Hungary and they says, okay, how were they able in a secularized societies to instrumentalize religion like this? We need to learn from them because that's what we want to do in the US too. And the counterparty, so to speak, does not understand how that transnational work is, that you need to be show solidarity, you need to think strategically, the secular civil society needs to be involved, you need to be more transnational. You need to create those networks too. And lastly, what is missing is the competence of a political strategy and political work in this area. So what is lacking is also ideas and knowledge how to go about this and how to take up the responsibility that you carry as a person who stands for a certain religious faith that also has positive aspects and not just these right-wing tendencies. So we cannot let faith be represented by people who do not see God's image in the other people, which is the essence of Christian faith, actually. So there are these weak points, and we need to use them. And this was one of the points why we founded Faith in Democracy, to support activists on site, locally, and to see how we can develop strategies and solidarity to tap into the potential of religious movements to counteract the anti-gender, anti-democratic movements, to block them, so to speak. Thank you very much. Chiara, maybe to conclude, before we answer questions from the audience, what do activists like you need, or what do people in the communities need? So you are supporting those communities. What do you need specifically, except for the political abstract level? So what kind of support do you need to help people? So
Soldi.
We need money. No, we need to consider that who fights to protect the rights to health and the human rights in Italy often does it on their own time as a volunteer, because these are often non-formalized networks and organizations. We have associations of volunteers mainly. So what we need, which means that next to our private life, we have this extra work, and we're always under pressure. So I would say we need to collect funds for campaigns and also in some cases just to pay for healthcare services. For example, if we have foreign persons, because there is one law that was passed under the Meloni government, that was the increase of the contributions foreign students had to pay to be part of the Italian health care system. And it is the solar year that counts. So let's say a person only studies for one semester in Europe. They still have to pay 700 euros for the entire year, and 1,400 even if they have family members. And these students, when they get pregnant and they want an abortion, and at the legislative level, this is seen as an urgent procedure. And even if there are time limits in the law, still, we often see a situation where we have someone on the phone and they tell us there's a queue at the hospital, they won't take me, and we don't know where to send them, so they have to travel between the regions. This is a typical day in the life of such a volunteer. And so to protect the rights, it is necessary sometimes to go to court, actually. So we need to find a legal team that is able to do this work and that works for free. And that's not easy. So we have huge economic barriers in this Italian situation. It's about money. It's very banal, actually. We're in a system that works with money. It's fueled by money. Well, thank you very much, and it makes total sense. For example, if you look at how much money the religious right movement has and all these networks, they have enormous funds. There is lots of money at that side of politics. Now, I would like, for the last minutes we have, I would like to hear from the audience. So if you have questions, comments, points for discussion, is there anything you would like to say, or if you have any specific questions to our panelists here?
Ja, bitte. Ich weiß nicht genau, wie das jetzt für den Livestream ist.
I don't know how it works for the live stream. Yeah, we have a microphone you need to use, please. So just so everyone online can hear you too.
I don't know, maybe English?
Yeah, you can also ask English. I will translate.
You can ask in English and I will translate.
Dann lieber auf Englisch, weil das mit der Übersetzung aus den Kabinen einfacher ist.
Okay. Ja. Lieber auf Deutsch.
Auf Deutsch, Entschuldigung.
Ja, okay. Danke für das.
So thank you very much for this great panel. I'm really amazed. It's amazing what great work you are doing. And I can imagine that it can be overwhelming at times. And Massimo, I would like to ask you about the personal implications for you, for your work at university maybe, when you work in this area in Italy, against the background that in these extreme right circles, there's a skepticism towards science in general. And if you combine that with anti-gender movement, so what are the implications for you on site?
Thank you for this question. Let's say that I work on this topic for the last 10 years, anti-gender movements. I started in 2013-14, and then I started to publish in 2015 for specific reasons. In 2013, I went from Paris to Verona for work because I had a research contract at the University of Verona. And when I got there, my research project was to work on the LGBTQIA+ movements, so not on conservative movements, but on the other side, on which I had already worked for. But when I got to Verona in 2013, 1 week later, it had been organized a first national conference against the gender theory, and it was organized by these movements. I was with the Association LGBT+, that had organized a manifestation against this conference, and the people talked to me because they knew I came from France, where there were manifestations of Manif pour tout, and they wanted me to explain what this gender theory was, what was this Manif pour tous. Therefore, I started researching to give a certain sense to this work of these movements. And then there was a lot of need for this work that I did, and I continued researching. Personally, what I lived in these years was surely a, how should I call it, a need to build my defenses, personal defenses, and that reading, daily tweet, interviews, social networks of these groups, and they give a violent message. It's a very violent message of these groups, and when you read them every day, it is really violence against myself when I read it. And my strategy was to use the instruments of science, the science against which these groups are, in order to study them, and so an object to keep, let's say, not to get too near. So this work I did required certain strategies, specifically the center of research where I work and people that are more structured. Had worked at university, so I had certain structures. So I had to build up these strategies to protect myself in order to not be too personally exposed to what these groups have learned to do. That means parliamentary interrogations in order to send inspectors of a ministry to the university to see who does what and who writes what. That means until now things have gone well. Unfortunately, I'm not alone, but I have a big network of people in Italy that works in this field. And in these months, we've been building up a new organization for gender studies in Italy, but we are all very aware. We don't know from now till the end of the legislation what will happen, and probably it will be always more difficult to have a certain freedom in research. There are certain signals, there's a certain risk, and we have defense strategies that we have implemented, and we hope these will work.
Vielen Dank auch für die spannende Frage.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this interesting question. Are there any further questions or comments, maybe?
Ja, bitte.
Yes, please.
Io faccio la domanda in italiano, ne approfitto visto che
Doing this in Italian, if it's possible. So I wanted to ask something about the right to parenthood. Maybe this is a bit off topic. So some years ago, we had a law that was passed in Italy, a law or a motion, where this was as a universal crime, a certain aspect, and I wanted to know whether this has been applied. If you had any examples where it was actually punished, that couples, same-sex couples who adopted, and they had problems, or if they had, okay, I think it was. Hired moms.
As far as I know, having discussed this also with the association that protect the rights of LGBTQ+, today there aren't any cases of people that had certain sanctions in the application of this law. What surely is happening, and that for the surrogacy, and that means for couples not only gay but also heterosexual that use this practice in the countries where it is legal, but also for the couples that use PMA, especially lesbians, that you make use of it abroad where it's allowed. What happened when the government started? They announced that they wanted to, so to say, persecute non-confirmed families that weren't traditional families. And they activated a fear. That means you need strategies in order to do differently. And this applies also to the family that have young trans and non-binary people who want to go and live abroad. That means that we also projects of people that want to set up a family and want to self-decide on their gender, and they cannot do it in Italy, or they're afraid of what the consequence could be. So the law on PMA was there to give a signal of fear and indicate to the people that don't conform and don't comply that Italy isn't the place for people who don't comply, so to say.
Ja, Wahnsinn. Danke auch für diese Frage, die Antwort.
Thank you for this question. Are there any other questions from the public?
Da, Benjamin.
Anch'io in italiano.
I shall ask in Italian. So the last thing that was said, I think it's important abroad that there's a...
Fare un commento, non una domanda.
It's probably more a comment rather than a question. I tell you, it's a comment, it's not a question. It's important abroad. One has the perception, the wrong perception, that before everybody was afraid of Meloni, a fascist, but in actual fact, we see that at a European level, she is respected and she respects the state. However, we have to underline that formally the democratic state, and in Hungary we know, remains. But we see that there's a lack of financing. And the first law in Italy was against rave party. That means nothing. It cannot be applied. The law to forbid GPA and PMA, so the medically assisted procreation. And therefore, it's important to remind people abroad that they see this government. This government isn't so bad. It's not like Orban. It could be worse. Certainly things can get worse. There are signs for this worsening of the situation in Italy. And we see that there are guidelines, there's the appointment we see the appointment of people in hospitals, at universities. We see a change in bureaucracy, and probably we didn't have a plan like Donald Trump, and we have to talk a lot about what's happening in our country in order for things not to get even worse. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Since it's possible, I'll ask in Italian. It's not very often possible. However, the question could be for all three of you. First of all, thank you to have brought your voice and witness here and also your expertise. I come from another field. You talked about the anti-gender movements, what they do at various levels of activism. And also you talked about the Catholic conservative movements. Now, we know from research that all these movements, in actual fact, have had a learning phase. So we analyzed the fights of the past, of the feminist, of the LGBT movements. So they have learned a lot. They've learned their strategies. And now my question to you, is there anything that we as citizens and members of civil society, as academic activists, can we learn from what is happening and learn from their strategies and from what they are doing in this moment, because they seem to be quite successful. And this, obviously, they have at the moment structures that they favor. However, is there anything we can learn from them and make use of it as an answer to what is happening?
Ja, sehr gerne, auf jeden Fall.
Yes, definitely. I already say yes, but actually they are structured. And I am in communications, and I realize that their communication is very professional. They divide the public, and they talk to each part of the public with a specific language. So they create a successful format, a centralized format, and then they divide it up, and it is applied then at a local level. That means so they collect the budget that they need, and then they receive the media materials in a central level. So it's not a little graphic designer that does it. So that's what we have to say in the activist world, definitely. Because we try to get organized with what we have. So if in the group of activism, if there isn't a person that is the one that takes care of communication, it's not possible, because otherwise you cannot understand anything. You do need an expert of communication. At the level of political strategy, we can also learn, because much has been learned at a local level, because we see the alliances. So we have to have alliances with who does politics in a party, because before we're a bit snob, who does policy in parties or people that don't really take care of the cause. And that's why we don't want to collaborate with them. It's them that want to use us to get votes. Whereas there's a bit of a division and instead we have to realize that we need to collaborate with politicians, because it gives a different vision. And there are also politicians that are really trying to change the situation. And also Fratelli, for example, in abortion, has shown to activists in Italy that this is the cause he is interested in, and has also helped us a lot. And he has explained to the people what are our problems. Many people have got the faintest idea what the real world is. But also at a local level, what I mentioned about the region Marche before, there was this alliance between those that did politics in the regions and those at a municipal level. So there was a dialogue. And this gives you more strength. The biggest problem that we have is to have certain alliances. That's what I see.
Dankeschön. Ja, gerne. Also, ihr müsst euch einigen, wer zuerst anfängt.
Ich glaube auf jeden Fall.
I think the question is just right? And the answer is yes, we need to learn a lot from the right. It may sound hard, but strategically we have a lot to catch up on. I think about would have thought 30 years ago that the internet that originally was a libertarian project, now it has ended up to become an absolute. I could think of all kinds of bad words. I mean, we have ended up with the situation we have. So this is something that shows, though, what dangerous connections there are between anti-democratic forces and a large part of the big capitalism. We cannot leave this unmentioned. We need to understand, analyze their strategies, and use what we can from them. But we will not have the same financial means because, of course, they also have those financial connections. The tech companies, etc. There is a very strong connection between big tech. We will not be able to copy that if we are on the pro-democratic side. We don't have these billionaires supporting us. But looking back to the past 100 years and all the big resistance movements and the big things we have won as a civil societies, pro-democratic things that we have reached, it has always been pretty much the same situation, but still we were able to do it, and we did it even though we didn't have so much money, but we had something else. We really had unlimited solidarity. That is not just strategic. It's really based on a different perception of being a human being, and that is our big strength, actually. Thank you very much. Massimo, would you like to add something?
Solo agganciandomi a quello che Jonathan ha appena detto.
I wanted to also say what Jonathan just said, and I would say that the answer to the question would be a bit provocative so what we should not imitate. So what you were saying, also to disrupt the symmetry, anti-gender, anti-rights, anti-choice, and on the other hand, we have the movements that defend the human rights. Because this is something that distinguishes these two sides. So we have on one side the organized groups that are entrepreneurial, hierarchic structures, like the model where they're coming from, the church model. And on the other hand, we have the movement that is formed of groups that are coordinated top-down. And then we have these local implementation. On the other side, we have the plural, democratic, broad movements that have militant branches too, that are present in society with individuals. And this is also to give you a bit of hope here. So what have we been discussing today? These politics, anti-democratic, authoritarian politics. That is a kind of a top-down revolution. The political class, the ruling classes are moving that. That's not a social revolution. The Italian society is not an anti-democratic society. That is not anti-human rights. Italian society that has always shown in surveys, this is a very secularized society. It is pro-human rights, pro-LGBTQ rights. It is in favor of sex education in schools. And sometimes it's just a lack of information on self-determination of gender. So we have to remember that the model, the authoritarian and hierarchic model, doesn't correspond to the history of the movements and the fights that have created the societies we are living in Europe today. So we are fundamentally a democratic structure.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. So if there are no further comments or questions, I would like to conclude, or is there someone who would like to say something? I mean, we can still continue discussing outside. I'd like to summarize the strategies I've heard from you, so we we'll not be too oppressed when we leave this room. So you did mention some strategies how to counteract the anti-democratic developments. So I've heard you say that we need to mobilize progressive religious forces. We need money for volunteer work, for lawyers and campaigns that can be organized to work at the local level. We need scientific awareness campaigns. We need networks between the different actors. We need to create connections, exchanges. We need professional and professionalized communication to the outside. We need alliances with parties, especially at the local level. We can have a big impact here. Political mandate holders can help us here. And we need democratic forces in civil societies. They are there. We just need to address them. We need to contact them. We need to mobilize them. So with this, I would like to thank you very much. If you'd like to add something, if we were missing something, would you like to say some concluding words?
Okay, wunderbar.
Okay, wonderful. Then we hope we have given some good impulses. I'd like to thank you for your great work and for your contributions to this panel. Thank you to ANPI and the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for making this event possible. I hope it will not be the only exchange we're having. I hope there will be support also the movements in Italy. So thank you all for coming, for discussing, and I hope we'll meet again soon.